Part 5. The Way Forward. What must stop, what can still be saved. This Part 5 operationalizes the ethical and legal principles introduced earlier. It translates them into immediate institutional responsibilities. It connects historical injustice and FPIC standards to concrete governance mechanisms, including suspension of land acquisition, transparency requirements, legal compliance, and accountability of state institutions, financiers, and international actors. It moves the narrative from diagnosis to action, and from principle to enforceable governance standards. It shows that land conflicts are not abstract debates. They require legal enforcement, financial discipline, and institutional reform, not rhetoric alone. There is one final illusion sustaining projects like Abusera Airport City, that once contracts are signed and machinery deployed, nothing can change. This, too, is false. Law does not disappear because construction begins. Rights do not expire because investors become impatient, and accountability does not end at the edge of a runway. What remains is a political choice. What must stop immediately? Immediate measures, all contested land acquisition, demolitions, and forced relocations linked to the Abusera project should be suspended pending independent legal, environmental, and social review. This is not an administrative delay. It is a constitutional requirement in any system that takes rights seriously. Recent years across Ethiopia's rapidly expanding infrastructure and industrial corridors have shown a repeating pattern. Land acquisition, disputes intensifying in peri-urban zones, compensation grievances escalating into litigation and protest, and communities reporting uncertainty over valuation standards and resettlement timelines. These are not isolated incidents. They reflect a structural governance gap between development planning and rights protection. Projects proceeding while legality is contested do not reduce risk. They multiply it. Security-led enforcement must end immediately. Development implemented through coercive presence is not development. It is forced compliance under pressure. Reports from affected rural communities in various investment and expansion zones in Oromia over recent years have consistently raised concerns about heavy security deployment during land clearance processes. Whether in infrastructure corridors, industrial parks, or urban expansion areas, the perception of coercion undermines legitimacy even where compensation frameworks exist on paper. Financing disbursements tied to land clearance should be paused until independent verification confirms compliance with constitutional protections, environmental safeguards, and international human rights standards. Safeguards delayed are safeguards denied, and safeguards ignored become conflicts embedded into the future of the state. What transparency requires. Transparency is not a public relations exercise. It is institutional accountability made visible. It requires full disclosure of all core project documentation, including complete environmental and social impact assessments, all annexes, technical appendices, and baseline studies, resettlement action plans with full livelihood transition models, compensation valuation methodologies, and land classification criteria, grievance, redress mechanisms, and escalation procedures, financing structures, sovereign guarantees, and lender agreements, risk-sharing arrangements, and contractor obligations. In many recent infrastructure controversies globally, including in emerging economies, the lack of access to such documents has been a central source of mistrust. Without information, participation becomes symbolic, and without participation, consent becomes fiction. These materials must be accessible in Afaan Oromo and other local languages. because transparency without linguistic access is not transparency at all. It is exclusion disguised as procedure. And secrecy in land governance is particularly sensitive, in contexts where historical memory of displacement still shapes political consciousness. Communities cannot consent to what they cannot understand, and they cannot trust what they are not allowed to see. What legal compliance demands. Legal compliance is not a slogan. It is a testable condition. It requires a fresh, independent, environmental and social impact assessment conducted before any irreversible phase of implementation continues. Not an internal revision, not a cosmetic update, but a genuinely independent review aligned with international environmental and social safeguard standards. It requires a credible free, prior, and informed consent process grounded in real participation rather than procedural formality. Recent global development practice increasingly shows that FPIC is no longer limited to indigenous rights discourse alone. It is becoming a baseline standard for legitimacy in high-impact infrastructure projects worldwide. It also requires recognition of communal and customary land tenure protections under Article 40 of the Federal Democratic Republic of Ethiopia Constitution. This is not optional interpretation. It is constitutional structure, and it requires judicial remedies that are accessible in practice, not only in theory. Affected communities must be able to challenge decisions without fear of retaliation, delay tactics, or administrative obstruction. Without enforceable remedies, rights remain declarative rather than protective. And declarative rights cannot prevent dispossession. The responsibility of Ethiopian Airlines. Ethiopian Airlines is not a secondary actor in this process. As a national flagship institution and project sponsor, it occupies a decisive governance position. In recent years, Ethiopian Airlines has expanded its role as a continental logistics and aviation hub, strengthening Ethiopia's position in African air connectivity and global cargo systems. That growth increases both its visibility and its responsibility. Because infrastructure credibility is no longer measured only in engineering output. It is measured in social legitimacy. The institution has the capacity to pause implementation, to demand lawful compliance, to require transparent consultation, and to ensure that national development does not become associated with forced displacement. Its global reputation is built on efficiency, connectivity, and expansion. But reputational capital is fragile, and in the modern development landscape, legitimacy risks often outweigh technical achievements in the long term. The legacy of any flagship carrier is no longer only aviation performance, it is ethical footprint. The responsibility of financiers. Financiers are not neutral actors. They are governance participants. International lenders, development finance institutions, and private investors all shape project feasibility through capital flows and safeguard enforcement. In recent global infrastructure practice, including major airport and transport projects across emerging markets, financial institutions have increasingly faced scrutiny over environmental, social, and governance compliance gaps. This trend is not symbolic, it is regulatory and increasingly contractual. Financiers must ensure that safeguard frameworks are not treated as documentation requirements, but as enforceable conditions. They must activate monitoring mechanisms, conduct independent due diligence, engage directly with affected communities, and condition disbursements on verified compliance. Failure to act is not neutrality, it is participation in outcomes. The role of the international community. International actors do not operate outside these dynamics. Diplomatic partners, development agencies, export credit institutions, and multilateral organizations all possess leverage in shaping how large-scale infrastructure is implemented. Global development policy has increasingly moved toward rights-based frameworks, emphasizing participation, environmental justice, and social safeguards as prerequisites for sustainable investment. This shift reflects global experience. Projects that ignore community rights generate long-term instability, even when they achieve short-term economic gains. The international community must use its influence responsibly, not to obstruct national development, but to ensure development does not undermine the legal and social foundations of the state itself. Silence in the face of contested dispossession is not neutrality, it is indirect endorsement. A final measure of national pride. National pride is not measured only by the size of an airport, or the height of a terminal, or the number of international passengers moving through a runway. It is measured by whether a country can modernize without destroying the communities that sustain it, whether economic growth can coexist with dignity, whether infrastructure can rise without law collapsing beneath it. Across recent development debates in Ethiopia and similar contexts, one underlying tension continues to define the future: the gap between rapid state-led modernization and community-level consent. Bridging that gap is not a technical challenge alone. It is a constitutional one, a political one, and a moral one. Abusera is more than a construction project. It is a constitutional test, a test of federalism in practice, a test of citizenship in action, a test of whether rights are procedural or real, a test of whether development in Ethiopia will be negotiated or imposed. Recent developments in infrastructure expansion across the country have made this question more urgent, not less. As urbanizations accelerates, and as investment corridors expand, land governance has become one of the most sensitive political issues in the country's development trajectory. The way it is handled will shape not only one project, but the legitimacy of the broader development model. The runways are not yet complete. The future is not yet fixed, and the choice still remains.